You're listening to the Two Tongues Podcast. And now your hosts, Kyle and Chris.
Bienvenue, everyone. Welcome back, one and all, to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast. Today I've got something special for you. Not exactly a revelation, because it's been, the information I'm going to talk about today has been around for a while. But the thing is, I didn't know about it. But I've been interested in the topics in general. So if you have been paying attention to where my interests have been gravitating lately, it's been in the area of shamanism, prehistoric spirituality in the form of some kind of shamanism or animism, and how that makes its way up into more modern religions like the Judeo-Christian tradition and others. So a lot of that, and it's related to a lot of interesting topics. It's related to the mystery religions that existed in the pre-classical world and in the classical world. It's associated with the oracles, and we've talked about the Sibyls recently. Those characters in the history of religion and mythology that have claimed to be able to see the future, foretell the future, to be able to experience, to be able to commune with the gods or experience the realm of the gods, to be able to travel there ethereally in their dreams, in mystical experience. And then all of these rituals that are designed to elicit mystical experience. And these mystery religions seem to be deeply connected to that. So, you guys are familiar with the Eleusinian mysteries. I'm sure we've talked about that quite a bit. The rites associated with the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, the Samothracian mysteries, we've talked about a little bit recently. And all of these other classical versions, Mithraism, the cult of Isis, the Dionysian mystery religions, and even the early Christian tradition all sort of grouped into that. And so what I've been looking at is how to detect or how to interpret these mystery religions and more modern spinoffs, how to detect in that this tradition from mystical experience and shamanism that shares an origin in our most ancient religious and spiritual beliefs. I truly believe that an individual personal experience of some kind, something that you would call, and has been called, a mystical experience or a spiritual experience. Other words that are synonymous are things like enlightenment, let's say. When you've had an experience like that, that it imparts a certainty about the spiritual components of existence that perhaps you didn't have fully anyway prior to a mystical experience. Maybe you've entertained those ideas, but it's not something that you take super seriously. So I am bouncing all over the place, really, but ultimately what this is going to be today is a discussion of Orphism. Orpheus is a very ancient mythological character associated with perhaps the first mystery religion, at least the first mystery cult that appears in ancient Greece. It may have come from further east somewhere in Asia. Thrace is where Orpheus is supposed to have been from historically. So I have to tell you, there's not a lot that we know about Orpheus. There's a lot of confusion surrounding him as a historical character, and even about those words, those quotations, those hymns that are associated with Orpheus and the Orphics. And this is no surprise. I mean, think about something like the Masons today, and if you're not a Mason, chances are you know jack shit about it. It's kept very secret. And this cult, this mystery cult surrounding Orpheus, is of like kind, and they all were, including early Christianity. Things were really kept under wraps unless you were initiate, unless you belong. You aren't going to know anything about it, and even those people who did know were bound by secrecy not to share any of that information. But what's so interesting is Orpheus was so important and famous in the pre-classical period. I cannot emphasize to you enough. If Orpheus was that influential, and so many people went through the initiation, the Orphic initiation, it's a real shame that all that's kept secret, because we can't tell you what that means or why it was so influential until the 1960s. Until the 1960s. Because a artifact was discovered in a grave. It's called the Derveni Papyrus. It's partially burned. It's kind of fragmentary, which we're going to see today. And what the Derveni Papyrus is a sacred scroll containing the hymn of one of the hymns of Orpheus, in this case about the birth of the gods and the cosmos, like the creation story. But it's got all of the commentary, the interpretation, you might say, of what the myth means, like it has a deeper meaning. And that deeper meaning is the secret meaning. It's the gnosis. It's the secret meaning that only the initiates know. It would be like going to Sunday school and learning the biblical stories as a kid and having a very surface level understanding of them. And then at some point learning through some religious initiation that story that you thought was just sort of a simple story with a simple message is far deeper and more esoteric. And if you come to the correct interpretation, if you arrive at the real meaning of the myth, then that's something that is not only transformative, like you're not going to be the same person after as you were before. That's what this initiation is all about. You're sort of reborn into this state of enlightenment. You're a new being. So there, you're going to feel some parallels even to Christianity when we talk about being born again and things like that. So without beating too much around the bush, let me just jump into this. I could just probably ramble on forever. I compiled this from several sources. I think it's important to give some background as far as what we know about Orpheus for those people who aren't familiar. He's somebody that's talked about by the pre-Socratic philosophers. He's talked about by Plato. Plato seemingly was an initiate of a mystery school, either of Orpheus, Dionysius, or the Eleusinian mysteries. It's not clear. So some of the sources that I'm going to bring to you are, of course, the Derveni Papyrus, but also a translation of some of the Orphic hymns that comes from 1792, a translation by a guy named Thomas Taylor, and he kind of gives us a nice introduction. So I'm just going to give you an intro that's sort of made up of pieces from Thomas Taylor and pieces from the wiki, and just kind of give you some ideas. So Thomas Taylor says that historical uncertainty is nowhere so apparent as in the person of Orpheus, whose name is celebrated by all antiquity, while scarcely a vestige of his life is to be found. This alone may be depended on. So he's like, this is how much we can say for sure. There lived a person named Orpheus in Thrace. Okay, that's like, it seems to be the area of Macedonia, Bulgaria, northwest Turkey, that sort of area. So this is where Orpheus was born. Born the son of a king, his name was Ogrius. Orpheus was the founder of theology among the Greeks. The first prophet, or the first of prophets, it says, and the prince of poets, who taught the Greeks their sacred rites and mysteries. So this is telling you more than you might think. It's telling you that Orpheus was associated with being the founder of theology among the Greeks. So what does that mean? It means prior to Orpheus, you had the myths that were told, largely orally, until we get to the time of Hesiod and some of these people that started writing them down. And, it's taught from parent to child, and that's how the religion continues. And as far as a critique of the religion or a synthesis of the stories or, any kind of exegesis or any of the stuff that we think about when we think about modern theology, none of that was really going on until Orpheus. So Orpheus is somebody who's pointing to the deeper meaning or maybe the true meaning or interpretation of their religious stories. And for this, he's considered to be the first of prophets. He's also associated with playing the lyre, maybe the person who invented it. That's obviously it's sort of a historical but also mythological component of the story. He was the prince of poets, and he sang the hymns while playing his lyre. Okay, he's always depicted with a lyre. And he taught the Greeks their sacred rites and mysteries. Now, this is associated with the teaching of theology, of the deeper understanding of the myths, and his contribution to the Greek world was introducing them to the sacred rites and mysteries. That word mysteries it's apt because we don't exactly know what they mean by mysteries. This is that stuff that was kept under wraps, the cult stuff that was kept secret for forever, for eons. They did a damn good job of keeping a secret because we only have bits and pieces and fragments from ancient authors. We really still have no idea what these mysteries are, but we're going to learn more about it today. Now, just to try to provide some clarity, when Thomas Taylor says that Orpheus introduced the mysteries to the Greeks, there's another ancient author from the 2nd century BC. His name is Lucian. And he said that Orpheus brought the magical arts to Greece. So you get some idea of what he means when he talks about the mysteries. Now, Lucian is saying it's the magical arts that he brought to Greece. Now, I don't know what that makes you think of, the magical arts, but it makes me think of ways to commune with the gods or to petition the gods. So magic arts have to do with certainly sacrificing and making the right offerings, but primarily it's what you're making the offerings for. It's inheriting some kind of ability or some kind of power or some kind of favor from, the gods that are transcendent. And so this has something to do with what the Orphics were all about. All right, so Taylor continues. He says, lastly, Orpheus, who by the melody of his lyre drew rocks, woods, and wild beasts, stopped rivers in their course, and ever moved the inexorable king of hell. Right, so this is how powerful Orpheus's lyre playing is. Right, he plays music so well, so beautifully, so mystically, that he can sort of control nature with it. He can draw rocks and woods and wild beasts to himself or wherever he wants them to go. It reminds me of a much later story that we're probably all familiar with, of the Pied Piper. Rather than a pipe, Orpheus is playing the lyre, but you get the idea. And when it says that he moved the inexorable king of hell, that's something that's associated with a very important myth surrounding Orpheus. It's usually just called the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. Eurydice is his love, and she dies and goes to the underworld, and Orpheus plays his lyre for Hades in order to convince Hades to let her come back to the land of the living, which is something that was never done, was never allowed. But he succeeded. So that's what he's referring to, and we'll get into that a little bit more deeply. But as far as Orpheus as a historical or mythological figure, he's kind of both. It's very difficult to say when he actually lived. But what we do know is that Orpheus was mentioned by some authors from antiquity, the oldest of which are Pindar, Apollonius of Rhodes, Plato, and Aristophanes. So with all that in mind, Orpheus, at least the stories about Orpheus, certainly predate the 5th century BC. And why that's interesting to me is if we're going to place Orpheus somewhere, maybe it's the 5th century or even before that sometime, this period, sometimes they call this the Axial Age, but let's just say this time period between 600 and 400 BC, this contains the rise of a lot of important religious figures. It makes you wonder why, what was going on around this time that proliferated this sort of thing. But in this time period, not only are we seeing Orpheus, but we're seeing Zoroaster in Persia, Confucius in China, Gautama Buddha in India, The pre-Socratics, of course, all the way up to Socrates. All of these people coming to the historical scene around this same couple of 100-year period. And Orpheus is right in there. All right, so we'll just bounce over to the wiki really quickly. I'll give you just a couple of words here. The wiki entry on Orpheus says something along these lines. It says, the Orphics revered Dionysus. Okay, so Dionysus is actually one of these ancient mystery cults, very, very closely associated with Orpheus. In fact, Orpheus is considered to have been like a priest of the Dionysian cult. So the Orphism that we're talking about and the cult of Dionysus may not actually be different things, but one sort of religious system. But here's why that's important. It says the Orphics revered Dionysus. Well, who was Dionysus? What's unique about this character, Dionysus? Well, he descended into the underworld and returned. Right? That's one of those things, like I said earlier, that Hades never allows. Like it's a rule of nature that isn't going to be bent for almost any reason. But Dionysus is one of these characters who descended to the underworld and returned. This is a death and rebirth scenario. So you see this image in Dionysus. Now, the underworld is not just a synonym for death, but it also is a synonym for the spirit world, the world of the gods. The underworld is like the unconscious. It's like the upside down. It's like the spirit component of our reality. So Dionysus is somebody who goes there and returns. He goes into the chaos, right? And he brings back the treasure. This is the hero story, in a sense, pre-formulated in this myth of Dionysus. Now, he's also called the twice born because he was killed and born again. He's the twice born. So this idea of being born again is something that we see in other mystery religions. Certainly early Christianity is key among them. So you have this interesting connection. So Dionysus is somebody associated with having gone into the spirit realm, being able to travel there like a shaman, and then come back and tell the world of the living what he saw there, you know. Also, the Orphics revered Persephone. And the myth of Dionysus and Persephone very closely related, because Persephone is the one who every year descends into the underworld to be with her husband Hades and gets to return back in the spring. Persephone is representing the pattern of the seasons, the death of life on earth and then the rebirth of the vegetation in the spring, that sort of a thing. So both Dionysus and Persephone are rare exceptions. These are people or gods who have the ability to go into the world of the gods, go into the underworld, into the land of death, into the land of spirits, into the spiritual realm, and return something which is never done. And these are the characters that the Orphics idealize. These are the characters that are central to their stories and myths. So the wiki continues. It says, Orphism has been described as a reform of the earlier Dionysian religion, involving a reinterpretation of the myth of Dionysus, but also of Hesiod's theogony, or these Greek stories about the creation of the gods and of the cosmos. And this is something that I want to highlight. Orpheus was a priest of the cult of Dionysus. So why do we call Orphism and not the cult of Dionysus? Because Orpheus was a reformer, right? Just like so many of these other people that I just talked about that came around the same time. Zoroaster, who was a monotheist or a dualist sort of prophet who comes to Persia and changes the whole polytheistic system there and reforms it, revolutionizes it, and brings about this new religious perspective. The same thing was done with Confucius. The same thing was done with Buddha, who of course was a Hindu, and from his life we get an entirely new faith. Just like Jesus, of course, was a Jew, and through his life we have an entirely new faith. Socrates was somebody who was pushing back against anybody who said that they were certain about anything. So you have these revolutionary characters all coming around this time, and Orpheus was among them. Religious reformers. Orpheus is saying there's something true about this Dionysian religion. But people have missed it. People have forgotten it, or people have been unable to sort of mine the truth from hidden deep in these stories. So it's about reinterpreting the myth. This is what the wiki means by reforming the religion. We're taking the same stories, we're taking the same gods, but we're coming to different conclusions about what it means. And this has created a spin-off faith that we're calling Orphism. So again, he's a religious reformer, somebody who's correcting the misguided, clarifying the true or secret meaning that's contained in these myths but forgotten. I also want to mention that the myths, especially the Greek and Roman myths, about the birth of Dionysus and the coming of Dionysus into the pantheon, shows him to be a latecomer, right? He's like a son of Zeus, but much further down the line. Like he's somebody who shows up on the scene much later on, after generations of gods have been born. However, we have evidence that Dionysus was worshipped in Minoan Crete, right? Going back even before the coming of these Proto-Indo-European Mycenaean Greeks. So Dionysus was worshipped before the coming of the Greeks, before the pantheon of the Greeks was there in Greece. This is somebody who was not a latecomer. This is somebody who the worship of Dionysus is deeply ancient and predates even the classical Greek religion in entirety. All right, so going back to Thomas Taylor, he says, the suffering and death of Dionysus at the hands of the Titans has been considered the central myth of Orphism. So we've talked about some of the myths, but this is the central myth. That Dionysus is killed by the Titans. If you don't remember who the Titans were, these were like the first litter of gods that were created. These were the gods that represent primordial forces and primordial nature and that sort of thing. So they killed Dionysus. According to the myth, when Dionysus was an infant, the Titans kill him. And I think they eat him. I think they consume him. In retribution, Zeus, who's Dionysus' father, strikes the Titans with a thunderbolt, turning them into ash. And from these ashes, humanity is born. And in Orphic belief, this myth describes humanity as having a body that's inherited from the Titans and a soul which is inherited from Dionysus. So, this is saying something very specific and very mystical, and it makes the hair stand up on my arms. These ancient Orphics believed that Dionysus, who they equate with Zeus, by the way, and I don't want to take a step ahead of myself too much, but Dionysus is considered to be the son of Zeus, but also one with Zeus. Kind of like Jesus is considered to be the son of God, but also one with God. You have something very similar here. And what this myth is meant to tell you is that you as a human being, and perhaps all created things, have a component of them, like the substance of what you are made of, is the leftover residue of these ancient deities that were destroyed by Zeus, the Titans, of these primordial forces of nature and psyche. Those things become physically what we are, and perhaps what the cosmos is. But not just that. Remember, the Titans consumed Dionysus. They consumed God, and that God is still there within them. And that passes on to the human beings that are created from those ashes, all the same. And this is the source of our soul. So a human being is, in its substance, made of God, and in its essence, in its soul, made of God. It's so beautiful. And if you think this is coming out of nowhere, especially from a classical or a Greek context, it's not. Like in the biblical story, I've talked about this many, many times, but in the biblical story, Adam, the form of Adam, is made by God and brought to life. by breathing his spirit into it. In Hebrew, it's called the Ruach Adonai, the Spirit of God, the breath of God. That's breathed into Adam. So what we have here is a form in which God is created, brought to life by God's very life force. So human beings have the essence of God in us. Even in the biblical stories, it's clear. But we can go back much further in antiquity. If we go all the way back to the Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian stories from Mesopotamia, which had huge influence on the religions of the world, but also, on the religions from Canaan and eventually Judeo-Christianity. They have a story of the creation of human beings in what's called the Enuma Elish, their creation account. And in this story, man is created from earth, just like you see from ash in the Orphic story or from clay in the biblical story. This earth is created the form of human beings, but mixed with that clay or with that mud is the blood of a slain god. They have to destroy this god. His name is Kingu, and they mix his blood or his essence into the clay that becomes the first human beings. So whether we're talking about Orpheus, whether we're talking about, Kingu and the Babylonian story of the creation of man, or the Ruach Adonai from the Bible, all of these things are telling you the same story, that God is in us. And then just to recap in my own words some of the other things that are important while we're talking about Orpheus. Orpheus is often well known from the story of Jason and the Argonauts. For those people who are familiar with that story, and maybe you saw the film, perhaps you've seen Orpheus was among the men going on the quest for the golden fleece. Of course, Orpheus has a role in his lyre and playing music, and all that stuff is consistent in this Argonaut story. And then the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, which we talked about a little bit ago. But just to summarize, Orpheus uses the power of his lyre, and that grants him the sympathy of the gods, even the sympathy of Hades, which, like I said, never happens. It grants him entry into the underworld while he's still living, a thing that almost never happens, where he convinces Hades to allow him to bring his wife back to the land of the living. Orpheus, though, disobeys the one command that he was given, not to look back to make sure Eurydice was following him. He had to go all the way out, up through the underworld, out into the world of the living, and he couldn't turn around to confirm his wife was there. If he did prematurely, then he was going to lose her forever. And of course, right at the last minute, he gets worried that maybe she's not there. He turns around and looks right before he enters the world of the living and forfeits his wife forever. And if that sounds like a familiar tale, in the Bible there's a story about Lot and his wife. I believe this is connected to the Sodom and Gomorrah episode, if I'm remembering correctly. And God is allowing them to flee, but tells them not to look back at the city. That's the one command. Don't look back. Lot's wife does, and what happens to her? She turns into a pillar of salt, right? So Lot loses his wife in the exact same way Orpheus loses Eurydice. It's an interesting parallel, but there you have it. All right, next thing I want to talk about is that Orpheus's ability, his musical ability, his musical power, it's mystical. Okay, and some people are okay with this idea of music being mystical, and there's all kinds of things that I don't understand well. I wish I did, but I don't. That are along the lines of, if you ever heard the ancient philosophers talking about the music of the spheres, or they talk about the associate, like we were just talking about Walter Russell the other day, and how his periodic table, his redesign of the periodic table, follows a musical pattern. And there are people that believe that mathematics and music are codes that are deeply ingrained in our psyches and in the world. That there's a connection between music and deep truths about nature and spirituality and all this sort of thing. And so this is all tied to Orpheus's ability to play the lyre. So for him, remember, he used the lyre to control nature and animals, to persuade Hades to let Orpheus go. So he's using music as a means of communing with the gods. His music is something like the magic that we were referring to earlier, that he taught to the Greeks. And the reason I wanted to leave this bit in here about the music and talking more about it is because it reminded me of the episode we did last week, or I did on the Omaha Indians. I mean, a people that couldn't be further away from the ancient Greeks as, you can imagine. And the Omaha Indians, they talk about learning music from Wakonda, from the Great Spirit, from the High God. They learn this music in a visionary, mystical experience. And those songs that they learn are then adopted by the tribe to be used during all sorts of ritual purposes. These magical songs that they're using for healing and for granting success and hunting and all these sorts of things that they've been singing for years all came from unique individual spiritual experiences where God communicated a song. God communicated powerful music to these initiates, to these kids that were going through a rite of passage ceremony, very much like this initiation that we're talking about with these mystery religions. We see relics of this everywhere. When it's time for you to become a man, when it's time for you to become a full-fledged member of the tribe, there's some initiation you have to go through. There's some experience you have to have. And there's a parallel between these rites of passage and these mystery religions. All right, then just to recap or just to reiterate that the Eurydice myth and this association with Dionysus that we talked about earlier, these both point to a connection to mystical experience. The way that I framed it earlier, like a shaman might, the ability to experience the spirit world, the ability to travel to the underworld, the ability to commune with God or the spirits, and also the ability to conquer death. All of these things are tied to these mystery religions. Certainly the Dionysian, conquering death, right? Dying and being born again. The same thing we see in the Christian faith. So you see all of this associated with a mystical experience, which I can certainly vouch for and attest to. There's something in a mystical experience that tells you death is only the beginning. As cliche as that might sound, something like that. It tells you that death is not the end. It tells you that there is no end. It tells you that all things are eternal because all things are God, including yourself. And then lastly, I want to add here that the earliest depictions that we have of Jesus, and I believe these appear in some ancient tombs, the earliest depictions we have of Jesus are Jesus dressed like Orpheus. You wouldn't recognize it. It's a young Jesus, a Jesus with no beard, a Jesus carrying a lyre, a Jesus with a sheep laid over his shoulders. These are not the image of Jesus that we're accustomed to, and yet they were some of the earliest. And scholars agree that the image that you're seeing is the image of Orpheus, Jesus as Orpheus. So there's all sorts of connections to these mystery religions, mystical experience, death and rebirth, and Christianity for that matter. That brings me to this next little short section I'm just going to call metempsychosis. Well, firstly, let's just do a vocabulary lesson. Metempsychosis. This is a word that the Greeks used, the pre-Socratic Greeks that believed in reincarnation, and many of them did, people like Pythagoras and so forth. Metempsychosis just means the transmigration of souls. It means exactly what you would see from Buddhism or Hinduism, this idea of reincarnation. And you see it in Orphism, and that's one of the reasons why they think the ideas of Orphism may have come from the East. Maybe from Asia originally somewhere. Historically, we're talking about Thrace, but could they have come from further east? And this is one reason why that might be the case. A couple of little tidbits I want to read to you. The first one says, essentially, that there was more than one Orpheus. And we sort of know this because the Orphic myths or hymns, we see them spread out over a sort of a long stretch of time, longer than one person's lifetime. So the idea is maybe there's more than one Orpheus. So let me just read to you some of this stuff. The first little fragment that I saw said that the original Orpheus, with that of the great men who have at different periods flourished under his venerable name, right? So ... The point is that when you're trying to understand the history of Orpheus, you're going to get an original, perhaps historical person from Thrace, but you're also going to get a number of other people afterwards who called themselves Orpheus. And then in the next little fragment here is from Plato, and it's talking about the vision of a person named Harris Pamphilus, and he talks about the soul of Orpheus is destined to descend into another body. So right from Plato, you have this idea of reincarnation where Orpheus himself is reincarnated. It's like the great prophet will be born again. You might have an image of like the Dalai Lama in your head, children being born, and they're like the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. There's something like that going on with Orpheus, where these other Orpheuses that appeared after the original Thracian character were considered like reincarnations, the next coming of the prophet. It's like evidence of this continual rebirth as an explanation for these various historical Orpheuses. But also showing a series of prophets that are sent over and over and over. And this is a common religious idea. We think about this certainly in modern religions like the Baha'i faith, where they believe that characters like Zoroaster and Jesus and Buddha and all these various prophets, they are a legacy of revelation. Like God is sending the prophets over and over and over again to human beings in different places, in different times, in different cultures, bringing the same message or correcting their coming off track in one way or another. And this is a continual thing. You can also see little hints of this sort of idea in Islam. So in Islam, they have this phrase, people of the book. I don't know the Arabic, so you just have to take my word for it. But they call people of the book people that deserve a certain level of religious respect that pagan people or polytheists would not garner. It's like God to the Muslims is requiring them to show respect and acceptance of people that received legitimate prophets at other points in time. And even in the Quran, the Zoroastrian folks, the ones that we call the Magi that were there at the birth of Jesus, they're considered people of the book, as are the Jews, as are the Christians. And in some contexts, even these Mandeans, these are followers of John the Baptist, very interesting group. So you have some of this here, which shows you that it's not uncommon at all to think about the prophets being born and brought back to earth, over and over again across time. All right, that brings me to the next section, which is about Orphic theology. We're going to get into some of the details, so let me just read it, just one paragraph for you here that talks about, again, this interpretation of the religious stories that Orpheus, that is what Orpheus was all about. And Thomas Taylor, he gives us this bit. He says, the grand arcanum of the Orphic theology is that God is all things. I could just stop there and reread that again. The grand arcanum of Orphic theology, the main gist of the whole deal, is that God is all things. So what you have here is something like pantheism. We would call that pantheism today, or panentheism. This idea that the cosmos and all the things in it, that you and I and the laws of physics and the whole kit and caboodle, space and time and everything in between, all of that is God. He goes on, he says, he is considered as containing all things, and yet as separate and apart from all. Okay, this is important too, because what this is saying is God is all things, and God contains all things. Well, that's a little weird, right? How can God be all things and contain all things? We're going to get there. But he goes on to say that God is considered separate and apart from all, even though he is all things. So this is a paradox. This is all very intentionally a paradox. But it does have a meaning. This is very Orphic. I think what I'm doing right now is very Orphic. It would be easy to dismiss this thing and say, how can God be all things and apart from all things? How can he be all things and contain all things and somehow be separate from all things? This doesn't make sense. I'm going to toss this in the garbage. The question, though, is there any way that you can make this paradox make sense? And if you can, perhaps you found some golden nugget. Perhaps you found some esoteric wisdom hidden in this, hodgepodge. And I think that is the case. I think what he's saying here, when he says God is all things and yet separate and apart from all things, he's saying that God is immanent, right? God is all things. He's immanent in you and I, immanent in the world and the cosmos. God is here and all things around us, immanent. But he's also apart from us, separate from us. So he's also transcendent. And this is a paradox, and it's so beautiful. Many religions consider God to be transcendent. This is not an uncommon thing for, monotheistic religions, let's say. God is apart from the world, greater than creation, different in kind, that floats above it and witnesses it. He's the thing that created it, and he floats above and witnesses it. That's transcendent. That's what that is. Immanent is in the world, right? God, the Spirit of God being breathed into man, God in human beings. Or in the biblical story, when the Spirit of God was floating on the surface of the waters, the primordial waters, when the cosmos is being created, God is in the cosmos, right? God is immanent and transcendent. Some religions prefer an image of God that's transcendent only. Others prefer an image of God that's immanent only. You would think about things like animism, tribal religions that think spirits are imbued in nature and all things. So God, whatever that, we're talking about spirit like the Japanese would call kami in the Shinto religion. Spirit's in everything. Some divine component in everything. Now, in that worldview, God isn't transcendent. He's not above, apart, looking down and observing. God is in it. Everything. So you see the distinction between God as transcendent and God as immanent. And what Orpheus is saying is that God is both. Man, that's some mystical shit. I love it. All right, going on. He says, as the source of all multitude, yet himself a perfect unity. Okay? So this is an ancient philosophical debate about the many and the one. And I could go into it. It would take me too far off the beaten path, but just understand God being the multitude and a perfect unity is just another paradox, just like we were talking about before. God is all things, contains all things, and is separate from all things. Paradox. That's important. That is designed to get you to think differently. It's a little breadcrumb trail of gnosis. That's what these paradoxes are. All right, he says, according to Porphyry, this is another ancient author, it says, God, intellect, and the soul are everywhere. It is one, it is all things, it is everywhere and nowhere. This is how Porphyry is describing God. God as intellect and soul, like, mind and essence, something that is everywhere and nowhere, something that is one but also all things. You see this paradox, the one and the many. How can God be both? As one of those little breadcrumbs of gnosis. And he says, and it is totally present in every whole. Its nature is expressed entirely by contrary properties. Right? That's the paradox. That's what I've called the Ouroboros or the syzygy many times. This idea of the Ouroboros is opposites in union. And this is a symbol of God, perhaps the oldest and most ancient. What is it that is the union of opposites? Is it possible that that is something? And if you can figure out what that is, then you've then you've reached this enlightenment. You've been born again. Your entire self and worldview changes, transforms. If you can only understand the meaning and the paradox. All right, that brings me to the next section. I'm going to call this section the Fragments of Enlightenment. And these are just pieces of Orphic poems that exist from ancient sources, either in fragment form or that were cited by some other people. I've got a couple of these that I want to read to you. So the first ones are short. This one's called Orphic Fragment 239. And it says this, real short and sweet. One Zeus, one Hades, one Helios, one Dionysus, one God in all. Isn't that an interesting thing from a polytheistic religion like the ancient Greeks? One Zeus, one Hades, one Helios. Zeus is the sky god, the king of the gods. Hades is the god of the underworld, but also very much associated with Zeus. Helios is the god of the sun. Dionysus is the son of Zeus, but the god of intoxication and all of this. So all of this that he's talking about, he ends by saying, one God in all. What he's saying is, Zeus, Hades, Helios, Dionysus are not different things. They're not different gods. They are one God in all. Now, this is fascinating to me because this is very much like tribal religions everywhere, very much like the Omaha Native tribe we were talking about last week. This is something that can be easily interpreted as a monotheism. It's a reinterpretation of the pantheon of gods, with Zeus at the top, understanding that all of these gods that fall underneath Zeus are not separate deities, but they're all some aspect of Zeus himself. There is only one God in all. So you've got this interesting henotheism, pantheism, frankly, primitive monotheism. And I see that more and more everywhere I look as I do research on ancient religions. All right, next is a fragment of an Orphic statement that comes from a fellow named Macrobius. This is from the 5th century BC, and he says, "The mysteries must be kept hidden. Understand that the highest god is Yao, who is Hades in winter, Zeus in spring, Apollo in summer, and gentle Bacchus in autumn." This is interesting. It's saying something just like we saw before in fragment 239. It's saying Yao, this high god, because it says the highest god is Yao, and he is Hades in winter, Zeus in spring, Apollo in summer, and Bacchus in autumn. All of these gods are Yao. Now, Yao is actually associated with Bacchus or Dionysus. There's all the same god. So there's something interesting there. But another interesting component to this Yao is that this is the phrase that was used in places in the Septuagint, which is the oldest original Greek translation or copy of the Old Testament. And Yao is used to describe Yahweh. Yao is used to describe Yahweh, the high God of the Hebrews. So not only do you have a concordance between Zeus, Apollo, Bacchus, and Hades, but now you have a concordance with Yahweh. Isn't that interesting? All these gods are one. All right, I want to read you a longer poem, partly because I want to give you some sense of the Orphic poetry. And this version I'm going to read to you is written in, it's translated into English, but it's written in a rhyming fashion, which is how in the original Greek it would have sounded, something that would have sounded like a song. These were hymns, of course. So I want to read this to you. This one is, well, let me just read it to you. This comes from another author. His name is Proclus. It goes like this. Zeus is the first and last thundering king. From Zeus all beings spring. And Zeus the male and female forms combined. For Zeus is a man, and yet a maid divine. Zeus the strong basis of the earth contains, and the deep splendor of the starry plains. Zeus is the breath of all. Zeus's wondrous frame lives in the rage of ever restless flame. Zeus is the sea's strong root, the solar light, and Zeus is the moon, fair regent of the night. Zeus is a king by no restraint confined, and all things flow from Zeus's prolific mind. One is the power divine and all things known, and one the ruler, absolute, alone. For in Zeus's royal body all things lie, fire, night, day, earth, water, and the sky. The first begetters pleasing love and mind, these in his mighty body Zeus confined. His eyes the sun and moon with borrowed ray, and his ear refined hears every voice and sounds of every kind. Thus all things Zeus within his breast concealed, and into beauteous light from thence revealed. All right, so just so you know, that was not the full poem. I gave you big chunks of it, but not the full poem, just for the sake of time. But I want to show you a couple of interesting things about this poem. When it says Zeus is the first and last, I mean, what does that make you think of? From the biblical perspective, God is the Alpha and Omega, the first and the last. So you have this same sort of language. Zeus is the first and last, the first thing and the last and everything in between. And it says as much, from Zeus all beings spring. And then it says some interesting things. In Zeus the male and female forms combined. What does that mean? I mean, Zeus is not typically depicted as a hermaphrodite, but what they're saying here is that Zeus is the thing that unites these opposites, the feminine and the masculine, right? The high God, the thing from which all being flows. That thing contains the feminine and the masculine together. You have the union of opposites in that image. You have the Ouroboros. When he says all things flow from Zeus's prolific mind, one is the power divine, it says. All this stuff is so amazing. All things flow from Zeus's prolific mind again reminds me of the episode we just did on the Omaha Indians, when their creation account begins like this. In the beginning, all things were in the mind of God. And what we have from Orpheus is all things flow from Zeus's mind. I mean, we see this, like this is a Platonic idea. We see this in the pre-Socratics. We see this in the Platonic philosophers, this idea of nous, this world of forms idea, that sort of thing. It's considered to be mind at large, the mind of nature, the mind of God. So you have this sort of theme, but it's very reminiscent of what will become idealism. This idea of the primacy of mind over matter. And it's also a very mystical thing. It's the kind of thing you hear from someone who's had a mystical experience. Certainly what a shaman will tell you, that mind or consciousness is fundamental. Perhaps it is all there is. And that's where we get this idea of idealism. When he says one is the power divine, I mean, a more mystical things could not have been said. This is what the mystical experience tells you. It tells you that everything is one. You hear the hippies say, I was one with the universe in that experience. That's the truth. That's the mystical revelation, is that everything is one. And then it says, for in Zeus's royal body all things lie. And this is kind of the whole gist of this hymn, by the way. When it says that, Zeus contains the feminine and the masculine, and then Zeus contains the basis of the earth and the deep and the starry heavens. Zeus is the basis for the sea and the sun. He calls it the solar light, the moon, all this stuff, right? All these things are in Zeus. And it says as much, for in Zeus's royal body all things lie, fire, night and day, earth, water, and the sky. So this is a very different understanding of what Zeus means or meant to the ancient Hellenes. Zeus was the high god with all these stories that you tell about them, with all these qualities and characteristics. But I don't think it's obvious in the slightest that Zeus was considered the culmination of all the other gods in one, and the source of all the gods, of course, and all of material reality, being and consciousness and everything else. And this is how the Orphics saw God. This last little bit of the hymn where he says, his eyes the sun and the moon with borrowed ray, and his ear refined hears every voice and sound of every kind. So what he's saying here, I just want to point out, if Zeus is that which hears every voice and every sound, it's something like the idea of God hearing your prayers. But it's also this related idea of God as consciousness, right? God hears everything, sees everything. Well, what hears and sees is consciousness. So understanding God to be mind or consciousness is something like what we're seeing here. And it's something that is part and parcel to mystical experience. And it seems to be without doubt that these mystery schools, the central sacrament of these mystery cults and practice, surrounds having a mystical experience. All right, just a couple more here. There's a hymn to Bacchus. I just want to read, remember, Bacchus is Dionysus, and Bacchus, Dionysus, Zeus. This is all one god to the Orphics. And this little bit here, he says, Bacchus I call, loud sounding and divine. Fanatic god, a twofold shape is thine. The various names and attributes I sing. O firstborn, thrice begotten, Bacchic king. Ineffable, two-formed, obscure, two-horned with ivy crown, union pure. All right, so this is a hymn to Bacchus, to Dionysus. And it calls him having a twofold shape. It says two-horned, two-formed. And this is this idea of Dionysus being both Zeus and Dionysus, but also this dual being. Remember, Zeus was called the masculine and the feminine. So this is the two forms of Dionysus. These are the opposites that the god unifies. Or that unification of opposites is what God is. Something like that. Calling him thrice begotten, I don't know enough of the classical stories to tell you exactly what that means. I know for sure of two birth stories for Dionysus because he's killed and reborn, but to call him thrice begotten rings of a trinity, and I think that's interesting. But he also calls Bacchus ineffable and obscure. I think that is something that is, it doesn't seem obvious to me that the ancient Greeks thought of gods that way. Ineffable and obscure. I think they thought of gods as, again, beings with certain stories associated with them, certain personalities. You knew which gods to go to when you had certain requests. You knew which sacrifices they liked. You know, they knew a lot about these gods. It was very detailed. So to call these gods ineffable, that seems like a far more abstract idea than the idea of the gods that we associate with classical Greece. It sounds much more like the God of the Old Testament, some power that's ineffable, that you can't even put into words, and obscure. See what I mean? Maybe unknowable. All right, before we get to the main event, the Derveni Papyrus, I want to read just a fragment of the hymn that the Derveni Papyrus is actually going to be talking about. Now, there were several Orphic hymns about the creation of the gods and the cosmos. They call these stories theogonies. The most famous Greek theogony is the Theogony of Hesiod, but this was different. This was called the hymn to Protogonus. I don't know how you pronounce that exactly. It means the firstborn. So this is the same epithet they used to describe Zeus and Dionysus. The hymn to the firstborn, the hymn to the first god, right? The hymn to fundamental reality. And again, this is fragmentary, but this is the hymn that the Derveni Papyrus is going to speak about. Here we go. It says, O mighty first begotten, hear my prayer. Twofold egg-born and wandering through the air. Bull roarer, glorifying in thy golden wings, from whom the race of gods and mortals springs. Hence Phanes called the glory of the sky. on wavering pinions through the world you fly. All right, so there's a lot more to it. This is what I'm going to share with you. There's a lot here we haven't talked about yet, and I don't want to harp too much for the sake of time, but let me just start here. When he calls Protagonist the first begotten, that's how you know he's talking about Zeus, the high god, this idea of God that the Orphics are trying to describe using the imagery and existing meaning of their pantheon. So he's asking this God to hear his prayer. He calls him the twofold egg-born. Okay, the twofold refers to this division into opposites that are unified in the God. This is the paradox that represents those little Gnostic breadcrumbs I was telling you about. So that he's the firstborn, he's the twofold, and he's the egg-born. Now this is something that we haven't talked about yet. He also calls this God Phanes, which we haven't talked about yet. So remember, there's this huge emphasis on equating gods with each other because in the Orphic understanding, there is only one God. So Phanes is going to be just another name for the same God that we've been calling Zeus and Dionysus and everybody else. But Phanes has got a specific quality and a specific look and the way it's depicted. So this is what I mean by egg-born. So the way that the Orphics considered the creation of the cosmos is originally an egg. And this is not an uncommon story. We have similar stories about the cosmos coming from an egg in kind of the Indo-European tradition. We see it in ancient Egypt. We see it in Asia. It pops up here and there that the world is hatched from an egg or born from an egg. And you can kind of imagine that, like you crack an egg in half and like half of the egg becomes the vault of heaven. And then the bottom half of the egg with the yolk in it becomes like the earth and the oceans. So you can kind of see this imagery of the earth being born from an egg. But more than that. So if we go back to the Babylonian story, the original primordial god is Tiamat and Apsu. And Tiamat and Apsu in that story, Tiamat is the feminine, the goddess. Apsu is the god. They both represent water, but Tiamat is the salt water and Apsu is the fresh water. And in the Babylonian story, these gods are together. They're one god, Tiamat and Apsu. And when they're separated, that's the process of creating the cosmos. In fact, the space between them after they're separated, this is considered space and time, the place where the cosmos can exist. While they're together, there is no possibility for the cosmos to exist. But what happens is, in their unity, they're kind of in a sexual embrace. And so in between them, or inside of them, you're getting all of this creation. All the gods are being created, the seeds of the cosmos are being created. And when finally Tiamat and Apsu are separated, everything can kind of come out of that. And so this is the idea of Phanes as the egg-born. Phanes is what the union of Tiamat and Apsu represents. And in fact, we see this theme in other religions. In the ancient Zoroastrian religion, you have these same two dichotomies. It's not Tiamat and Apsu. In this case, it's Ahura Mazda and Ahriman. Ahura Mazda is sort of the god of good. Ahriman is the god of evil. But originally, they were one thing called a Zervan. Until they separated, right? They were one thing in this original unity called Zervan. And the Scythians, they have a very similar concept in a goddess that they call Tabiti. Tabiti is the union of the two primordial gods, the masculine and the feminine. So Phanes is the twofold egg-born from whom the race of gods and mortals spring. Right? This is the source of all things. And that brings me to the Derveni Papyrus. All right, so remember, Orphism is shrouded in mystery along with all these other mystery religions. It's not clear at all what the Dionysian mysteries were really all about, what the mysteries of Mithra or Isis were really all about. We have little bits and pieces we don't really know. And the same is true with Orpheus, maybe more so with Orpheus and Orphism. But the Derveni Papyrus, this is something that, I don't know if you've seen, like in the ancient Egyptian world, they had these texts that they would bury with with mummies, or they would paint on the walls of the crypts that were telling them where they were going to go in the afterlife, and how they were going to pay the person to get across the river Styx or whatever, and the questions that they're going to be asked by the gods, what to expect, and how to navigate, the place in between the living and the dead. And it's basically instructions. And something like this is what we see in the Derveni Papyrus. Here we have a person who was an Orphic initiate, who died and was buried with this document that was supposed to help him in the afterlife. And this document was intentionally burned. And you can understand why there was a funeral pyre, right? So usually the body's being burned, and whatever relics or things are buried are contained there with the corpse are burned. It's something like a sacrifice, and this sort of thing's not all that unusual. And burning this papyrus was meant to conceal the information in it, right? It's going to burn with the body. The smoke goes up to heaven, so the soul has access to this burnt document, but grave robbers aren't going to have access to it. It's another piece of that, secrecy that surrounds these mystery religions. We're going to burn this document so that people who aren't initiated aren't going to stumble on this grave and see these secrets that they were never meant to or allowed to see. However, the Derveni Papyrus did not burn all the way. And so I'm going to read you a piece from the Bible here, Matthew chapter 13, where it says, "I will proclaim what has been hidden from the foundations of the world." And that's what I feel like I'm getting ready to give you here. So the Orphic mysteries that have been hidden from the foundation of the world are in this Derveni Papyrus. So a little bit of an introduction about the papyrus before we jump into the text. It's an ancient Greek papyrus. It was discovered in 1962 in a grave in Macedonia. And when they found this document and they began to read it, that they noticed that really it's like an interpretation or commentary on these Orphic poems. Not specifically this one that we just read about, the birth of the gods, from Phanes, or this firstborn character we're talking about. The document, this papyrus itself, dates back to 340 BC. This is a very old grave where they found this document. In fact, this papyrus is the oldest surviving manuscript ever found in Europe. And I told you it was intentionally burned in the funeral pyre, but it was only partially burned. And what's interesting is this process of carbonizing the papyrus when it was burned, that actually contributed to its preservation. The fact that it was partially burned is the only reason that it survived this long for us to see it. So we get to see what was never meant to be seen by the uninitiated, and what up until 1962 was literally lost to time. So this papyrus, this poem, this theogony that I just read to you, it's something that's used in the initiation mystery cult of Dionysus. So when you become a member of the cult of Dionysus, which Orpheus was, reading this myth was part of this process. And like we talked about, Orpheus being someone who's interpreting these stories, it helps you to understand that the mystery cults, like what they were all about. They were all about the occult or esoteric or deeper or true meaning of the myths that everybody knew already. Everybody knew and loved, but didn't really understand. So this Derveni Papyrus gives you quotes from the theogony, and then it also gives you the interpretation, the Orphic understanding of what the stories are saying. And they show, this Derveni Papyrus shows that these hymns, they don't mean what they literally say. They mean something else. And this poem, it begins with these words, "Close the doors, you uninitiated." And this is a famous admonition to secrecy that actually we see the same thing in Plato, the same words. This is partly how we know Plato was initiated into one of these mysteries. So Orpheus wrote his hymns as allegories. There's something like the way Jesus wrote in parables, right? The meaning isn't obvious, and Orpheus is giving you the deeper meaning. And that brings me to the text. I'm only going to give you pieces of it. A lot of it is fragmentary. As you can imagine, it was partially burned. The translation I'm going to give you is from Richard Janko. This is from 2001. There are other translations, but this is the one I'm going to use. And I want to give you a taste of it. All right, so the Derveni Papyrus says, Orpheus was speaking allegorically, for it was impossible for him to state what was meant. His composition is a strange one, riddling for human beings. All right, so he's just coming right out and saying the hymns of Orpheus are allegorical. They require interpretation, and there's only one correct way of understanding the esoteric or true meaning of the stories. When he says it was impossible for him to state what was meant, this is why he's speaking allegorically, because he couldn't just come right out and say it. I wonder if he means because what he wants to say is ineffable, what he wants to say, what he wants to communicate can't be communicated in words or concepts, because this is a common problem for people who have mystical experience. It's life-changing, revolutionary experience. First thing they want to do is share it with the world, people they love, their friends and family, and nobody understands what they're saying. I have had that very same experience trying to talk about my own mystical experience. Like, nobody understands because they haven't had the experience. So is he speaking allegorically because he can't say it? It's actually can't be put into words? Or is it because it's a secret? Can he not come right out and say it because it's a mystery that's supposed to be kept secret? All right, he says this too. He says, Orpheus says that night, right, this is the goddess Nyx, associated with this primordial chaos, the night. It says, Orpheus says that night prophesied from the Aditon, which is like the center part of the temple, like the Holy of Holies. You might think about it like that. So night prophesied from the Aditon, because the depths of night is Aditon. What does that mean? Night prophesied from the Holy of Holies, because the depth of night is the Holy of Holies. Like, I don't know what this is supposed to mean. You can see how confusing that is to try to wrestle with. But what it sounds to me like this is saying is that night, which is, again, Nyx is this primordial goddess associated with chaos. In the Theogony of Hesiod, chaos is sort of the thing that's there in the beginning, the thing that you might connect with Zervan, Tabiti, or Phanes, this union of opposites, primordial god thing. So Nyx is associated with this, especially in the Theogony of Hesiod. So that thing, the chaos that was there in the beginning, that thing prophesies. It's like the future is known to that thing. So that's interesting. But let's just keep pushing right along here. He says mind. Now, in other places in the Derveni Papyrus, he associates mind, which they called nous, the Greeks called nous, with the god Kronos. And if you don't know, Kronos is supposed to be the father of Zeus, so this is like the pre-formation of Zeus, that which came before Zeus, that which was necessary for Zeus to be, his father. So it says mind caused the elements to thrust against each other and made the things that exist once they had been separated. Okay, so that's probably gibberish to you, but let me try to help you here. When he says mind caused the elements to thrust against each other, you have to picture elements bumping into each other, anything at all bumping into. If you bumped into me, you would recognize that I'm there, right? When the elements are thrust into each other, they become aware of each other. So what's being described here is something like experience. And what he's saying is mind causes this to happen, causes experience to happen. And this made the things that exist once they had been separated. So, mind causing the elements, all of the components of reality to experience each other. This is equated to the process of separation. Remember, Tima and Apsu are together. That's the god Phanes. It has to be separated, for the creation to occur. And this separation, Orpheus is saying, is caused by mind. Mind causes motion. Mind is responsible for experience. And the moment you become aware or conscious of something else, the moment you thrust things together, that you bump into them and you're like, oh shit, you're here. Now I have this experience of this other thing that exists that isn't me, right? Because I've bumped into it. And this is the idea of the unity, God being this one thing, how that one thing comes to realize that it's many. It's through a process of experience or self-experience. And that is seen as kind of an illusion, but more importantly, it's seen as being caused by mind. When it says that it made the things that exist once they have been separated, this is the idea of things themselves, separate individual discrete things, don't exist by themselves until they've been separated. Separated from what? From the original state of unity, from Phanes, from this original state of unity that the Orpheus just call God, essentially. All right, then they introduce this next verse. So this is a verse from the hymn. It says, "From him in turn came Kronos, and next was crafty Zeus." And the Derveni Papyrus says, Orpheus meant that by thrusting the things that exist against each other, he caused them to stand apart and created the present transmutation, not creating different things from different ones, but different ones from the same. So you see what he's saying? He's saying this process of self-experience that mind creates generates this idea of multiplicity, right? So that now there's all of the things that are in the world, the sun, the stars, the heavens, the earth, all that stuff, even though in reality, all that stuff is only one thing, Phanes. All that is only Zeus. All that is only God. All that is only mind. But through this process of self-experience, it seems to be many things. And he calls that, he doesn't call it creation, he calls it transmutation. Why? Because he's not creating many things from many substances. He's creating many things from one thing, from the same thing, the only thing that exists, the divine unity. It goes on, it says, the phrase, "and next was crafty Zeus," reveals that he is not a different god, but the same one. So again, there's this unity of the gods. And it's like a secret thing to know that the gods are all one, that all the different deities that with their different properties and stories and personalities are just pieces of this greater reality that is God with a capital G. This is not something that everybody knows. Only the initiates know. All right, let's continue. He says, all that had been born, he himself alone became. So this is another verse from the Theogony. He says, in these words, he hints that things which exist have always existed. The phrase, he himself alone became, by saying this, he reveals that mind itself, existing on its own, is equal to everything else, as if the rest were nothing. See, this is where I was talking about the illusion of multiplicity here. He says, for it is impossible for these things that exist to exist without mind. Mind, king of all. So the real critical part really, I think, is the beginning, where he says, all that had there been born, he himself alone became. This is saying that God did not create the reality and the gods and all that. He didn't create it. He became it. You see what I mean? God is the unity. The unity didn't create from nothing, ex nihilo. It became the things that exist. And that means that all the things that exist pre-existed. They've always existed in that unity, in God. It's not like they had a beginning. They're eternal. All things are eternal, like God is eternal. All right, then he gives us another quote from the Theogony. He says, Zeus was born first. Zeus of the shining bolt was last. He says, this verse proves that Zeus existed before he was named, for he did not come to be, but pre-existed. Orpheus is stating that the things which exist became such as they are on account of Zeus, and having come to be, are all in Zeus. He only gives hints in the verse, quote, Zeus is head, Zeus is center, all things are from Zeus. So what he's trying to say here is, when the text says that Zeus was the firstborn and Zeus of the shining bolt was last, it's like as Zeus came into the consciousness of the ancient Greeks and was given this name, Zeus, that what Zeus really is existed before. It existed before it was created as an idea and before it was named. It was there even when you read the Theogony and it says, that Zeus was created by Kronos. It's like even that's not real. Zeus and Kronos are not different, and Zeus existed even before. He pre-existed. Zeus is this unity. God is this divine unity that is eternal. All right, he goes on, he says, the earth and all the other elements are in Zeus, as he is breath. So the earth and all of the elements are in Zeus. Kind of like something we've already heard many times. As he is breath. Now, so God is considered breath, which is a word that's synonymous with spirit or soul, right? Because when the breath leaves you, the spirit leaves you. So that was the same thing breathed into Adam, right? The spirit of God, the breath of God. So he's saying Zeus is breath. God is life. Then he says, each individual thing has been called after the dominant element in it. All things were called Zeus by the same principle. All right, so he's just saying, like, they had this idea of the elements being like air, earth, fire, water, ether, that kind of thing. And he's like, if you have a thing and it's made up mostly of fire, then you're going to call it fire. Even though it may be mixed with other things, the dominant element in the thing is going to define what it is. And he says, all that exists, the dominant element in all that exists is God. It's beautiful, beautiful. All right, then he says, to one who hears the verses, the story appears to say that Zeus had intercourse with his own daughter. Then he gives us that verse. He says, when Zeus first mounted heavenly Aphrodite and begat from her persuasion and harmony. And he says, by saying when Zeus mounted, Orpheus reveals that the elements divided into little bits moved and mounted, and by mounting were put together with each other. They kept mounting until the point where each had come to its like. So what is he saying here? He's saying something that reminds me of atomic theory in some way. He's saying that all the elements that make up the world, it's these little bits he's talking about, they're all moving and mounting. What does mountain mean? Well, in the sexual analogy that we just gave, Zeus, with his daughter in this case, he mounts her, he gets on top of her, right? So you see these elements mounting each other. And the elements are coming together, and it says they keep mounting until the point when each had come to its like. So these elements that make up the world mount, they continue to sort of stack up until they become a specific thing. Well, this is atomic theory. This is very similar to what we talk about in modern science. Very interesting. Now we see some ancient Greeks like Democritus and so forth that had this atomic theory, already. So I don't know if Orpheus comes first or if Democritus does. Probably Orpheus does. But then he continues. He says, Aphrodite, Zeus, Aphrodise, Mount, Persuasion, and Harmony are all names for the same God. Whew, isn't that interesting? So Aphrodite is the goddess of love, as you know. Love was considered by some of the pre-Socratics to be a force like gravity that brings things together. So when he says, Aphrodite, Zeus, Aphrodise, Mount, he says all of these are words for the same God. That's another little breadcrumb of gnosis. You have to wrap your mind around what does that mean? That God is Aphrodite, Zeus, persuasion, harmony. Like these are all qualities or characteristics that explain some part of this infinity that is God. They help you to know this unknowable thing that we call God. He goes on, he says, a man uniting sexually with a woman is said to Aphrodise, as the saying goes. For when the things that now exist were united with each other, God was named Aphrodite. Okay, so there's part of the explanation, but isn't that interesting? Remember, love is the force that brings things together. And actually, strife is the force that pulls things apart. And that's just one of these pre-Socratic ideas. So he's saying, listen carefully. When the things that now exist were united with each other, right? When all the things that flowed out of Phanes, that flow out of the original God, when those things, if you rewind the clock, right, you rewind the Big Bang and everything comes back together to that original singularity, to that original divine unity, that thing, he says, you could call Aphrodite. Because the love of God is so great that it pulled everything together into unity. It says he was named Harmony because he fitted together many elements to each of the things that exist. For they had existed even before, but were named as coming to be after they had been separated. So he's just saying this idea of being created or coming to be isn't a creation or a coming to be. It's a separation. Bernardo Castro talks about this psychologically as dissociation. It's like you can have one thing, if you're going to call this mind or nous or the mind of God, how does this one thing become many and remain one thing? Because it does. Because that's the paradox. And Bernardo said, well, if we're talking about mind, just imagine a dissociation. Imagine that. If you have this one mind dissociated into infinite others, they would see themselves as unique individual things. They wouldn't understand their connection to the whole. It wouldn't be obvious to them because they're dissociated from it. But the truth is still that they're a divine unity. And I think there's shades of that here. All right, he says, Earth, Mother, Rhea, and Hera are the same. She was called Earth by convention, Mother because everything comes from her, Gaia and Gaia in accord with individuals' dialect. She was called Demeter, like Geometer, a single name from both. She was called Rhea because many animals were born easily from her. Rhea means easily. So here again, you just have this very mystical merging of all of these gods. Gaia, the earth, Rhea, and Hera, which were the wife of Cronus and Zeus, all these, and Demeter, right? This goddess of the grain and agriculture and the cycles of agriculture and so forth. All of these things that we think of in classical Greece as separate deities with, originating from different stories, different paths, different qualities, characteristics. No. Orpheus is saying, these are all ways of understanding the one thing, the one God. It goes on, there's a couple more here. He says, to those who comprehend it aright, it is obvious that ocean is air, and that air is Zeus. So here again, just like we saw before, you have this conflation of all of these deities to recognizing that they all are one divine unity. And then he says as much. This last bit I want to share with you. He says, had not God desired the existence of those things that now exist, he would not have created the sun, but he created it. Now, it's a little bit weird because there's missing context here where he talks about the sun as the sort of genital organ and like all of the gods coming from it. So that's neither here nor there. What I want to point to is how he begins. Had not God desired the existence of the things that now exist? You notice he doesn't say, had not Zeus, had not the gods, had not the Olympians, none of that. Had not God, singular. Isn't that interesting? So you have this subtle monotheism that Orpheus is bringing. And because Orpheus is so closely linked to characters like Jesus, who were champions of monotheism, and Jesus himself being depicted as Orpheus in these ancient tombs, it's very easy for me to look at a character like Orpheus as a forerunner of the Christ figure who's going to bring monotheism to Europe and to the world. It's easy for me to look at Zoroaster. Remember, somebody who was born around the same time as Orpheus, similar as a religious reformer, who does something similar in Persia. And the Persian Empire was stretched all over the place, bringing monotheism, or a form of monotheism, to the world. And that brings me to my conclusion. Okay, so what have we learned from the Derveni Papyrus? What hints of those mysteries which survived in secrecy for eons can we now glean? Have we all just become initiated? Are we Orphics now? Can you feel the gnosis pulsing through your veins and radiating from your fingertips? Oh, just me? Okay, well then, in all seriousness, we can say a lot after exploring the Derveni Papyrus. Key among these is that Orpheus taught the meaning of ancient myths, which were always concealed in them, but which are not obvious or on the surface. Orpheus took the ancient Greek theogony about the origin of the gods and the cosmos and revealed its esoteric meaning. Not unlike Jesus' parables, he reserved the revelation to those worthy of gaining it. Only to the worthy and the capable and the curious. This is powerful wisdom, after all, and should not be shared without proper caution. So what is the Orphic revelation? What are these ancient myths cryptically trying to tell us? Firstly, that such a thing exists as God with a capital G. And that the gods we know and love, Zeus, Dionysus, Gaia, Hades, Rhea, etc., are all aspects of this God. God is the sky and the king, which they call Zeus. It is mind, which they call Kronos. It is the earth and the power of life, which they call Gaia. It is the underworld and its lord, Hades. You see what I mean? But God is more still. The Orphic hymns remind us that Zeus is heaven and earth, sun and moon, night and day, and the very breath of all. In summary, Orpheus tells us that God is all things and contains all things. But how, do tell, can God be all things and contain them? How can God contain itself? What an interesting paradox. But this is only the tip of the iceberg. Orpheus says that God is everywhere and nowhere. How can this be? How can something be the union of opposites? These all speak to the same paradox. The same thing implied by Zeus, described as heaven and earth. Zeus and Dionysus, which by the way is God and its own son. How can that be? How can God be its own son? How can God be night and day? What is being described is the Ouroboros, what Orpheus called Phanes. It is that which was there before anything, the eternal thing from which all being flows. It is the nothingness achieved when opposing forces merge, up and down, masculine and feminine, potential and actual, fused into one. They seem to cancel each other out. They seem to disappear into one another. But this is only the limit of our comprehension. In truth, this divine nothingness is sheer potentiality, that which can become anything. It is the cosmic stem cell, undifferentiated and pregnant with possibility. This is what God means. Orpheus does not stop here. He even tells us how this divine unity resolves the paradox of its own essence, how God can be all things and also contain them. Orpheus tells us that, quote, all which had been born, God himself became. Not created, but became. Among these creations are, of course, the cosmos of space and time and everything within it. Surely, if God is space-time, as well as all the things which occupy it, it is indeed all things and contains them. But now you're probably asking, if God is all things, the gods, the cosmos, you and I, how is it that we're separate from God? How is it that there are many rather than just one? But old Orpheus answers this for us too. He tells us that God is mind, and that mind distinguishes. It separates things. Mind differentiates discrete things from the oneness, and thereby they seem to stand alone. I say seem because it's portrayed as a kind of illusion. Orpheus tells us that mind caused the elements to, quote, thrust against each other, to experience one another, and through this self-experience, recognize themselves as something other. He refers to this as transmutation rather than creation, suggesting that all things are but forms of the one. And I'll leave you with this. Orpheus reminds us that things are defined by their dominant element, and that the dominant element in us is God.
Well, there you have it. That's one avenue explored, but infinitely more still to go. I hope you enjoyed thinking along with us. I know. It's not easy work. Thinking. It's hard and full of uncertainties, but I'm grateful for the company as we trek through this together. Here's to hoping that the juice is worth the squeeze. See what I did there? Let's find out together in the next episode.